This is your daily scripture for January 21st. My name is Henry Loke. This is God's Feeding Station. Honored to be with you again today as we continue in Mark, the Gospel of Mark. We are in chapter 15 today. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast he used to release to them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him!" And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passer-by, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them, to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion, who stood facing him, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph and of Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. So the crucifixion has been discussed at length, great length, by people a lot smarter than me. But I thought today, rather than repeat the same things over and over again, excuse me, geez, let's just talk about Pontius Pilate for a minute. Who is this guy? Because he obviously knows that Jesus is innocent. He tries, I think, 3 times to sell it to the Jews to release him. But in the end, he concedes and hands Jesus over to his forces to be crucified. And let's be clear, while the Jews arrested Jesus and convicted him of crimes deserving death, whatever crimes they wanted to make up in the dead of night, the bottom line is they could not kill him, right? It was against the law. And so rather they had to hand him over and convince Pilate that Jesus was a threat. Now, Mark is very, I'll say, brief in his descriptions here. There are, and we'll talk about these when we get to the other Gospels, but there are arguments that are used, as noted in the other Gospels, of how Jesus was an insurrectionist and how he was a threat to Rome. Outright lies, but effective nonetheless. But if we go back to Pilate's role here and responsibility, there is, and if you don't, I would encourage, if you're interested in history that cross-references biblical accounts, I would recommend getting the histories by Josephus and Philo. I have them, and they're really interesting reads. And again, not to put them on the same level as the Spirit-influenced Bible, but definitely have some good information in there. He doesn't come across as a guy who's going to bend to the whims of the crowd. Philo describes him as being inflexible and stubborn and cruel. But Mark takes a less harsh view of him. Whether or not it's because he's writing in Rome when Nero's in charge, could be. In order not to antagonize the governor you're living under. But Pilate's role here is probably not as negligible as described sometimes. Again, he's crucified, and crucifixion was a Roman execution. So Roman authority is ultimately responsible for the death of Jesus. Right? Roman soldiers, if you go to John, Roman soldiers were at the arrest, and there has to be some type of coordination and cooperation between the Jewish authority and the Roman authorities, because there is this basically kind of rubber stamping and rush through to get Jesus crucified. I mean, it happens fairly quickly. So, there's some, washing of each other's hands here in the government machinations between Rome and what's going on in Jerusalem. So anyway, Pilate's the 5th Roman governor of Palestine. He bears the title prefect, and he was probably he had the longest tenure of any of the 14 Roman governors of Judea. He was prefect from AD 26 to 37. He wasn't incompetent, but he was pretty stubborn. And eventually that's what gets him in trouble with Gaius, Caligula. A couple of notable incidents. And we've talked about this one, I think, before in years past, but Pilate had no stomach for Jewish tradition or custom. And he brought military standards bearing the emperor's bust into the city. And that violated the Jewish ban on images. And so the Jews, en masse, went to Caesarea, to Pilate's residence, 70 miles away, and they staged a nonviolent protest for 5 days. And Pilate was initially unmoved, and he gave orders for the soldiers to kill him in the stadium. But the Jews bared their throats, and they welcomed death rather than see their law being transgressed. And so Pilate relented. Right? That comes from Philo. There's another occasion. Pilate spent money from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct, a 23-mile-long aqueduct to bring water into the city. And again, he is protested against by Jewish loyalists, and because they objected to the use of temple funds to be used for public works. But this time, Pilate and the protesters exchanged blows, and a large number of protesters are killed by the soldiers. And in fairness, the soldiers went far above and beyond what Pilate had ordered them to do. Others were trampled to death in the attempt to flee the situation. And so that was a black mark on the record of Pilate. Third time it's mentioned, and this one's mentioned in the New Testament, there is something that happens where Pilate has slain a number of Galileans who brought offerings to Jerusalem, and he mixed their blood with their sacrifices. And so the straw that broke the camel's back from the history books is where a nondescript Samaritan uprising Pilate violently put down, and that what's eventually led to his removal. So he doesn't seem like a guy who's going to be easily persuaded. He's stubborn, hot-headed. It seems like. Josephus and Philo describe those under his rule as equally stubborn and defiant. And while he wasn't brutal in terms of Caligula or Nero, he would use force and direct it at parties responsible rather than to the general citizenry. He wasn't overly corrupt. He was capable of doing things that were good for the places he governed. He wasn't always stubborn to a fault. His removal of those things he brought in, the symbols he brought in, is record to that. And again, he's noted for probably more police brutality than public executions. So I guess maybe typical when you're thinking about Roman prefects, probably ruling over a place he has no desire to be. But, and when you look at it, Pilate seems to be a guy who looks at Jesus as somebody to be watched, but not somebody to be disposed of. And while he's no stranger to protests, now he's caught somewhat between a rock and a hard place because he knows this man is innocent. The things that he's being accused of, there's no evidence of it, but he has this hotbed of political problems to govern over. And what he's weighing is, how do I keep the peace? How do I keep the peace? Because these guys I'm dealing with are the ones that can dump gas on the fire, or they can quell the problems before they get to me. And in the end, he concedes. And he hands Jesus over, because to him, what's another false prophet? What's another dead Jew to Rome? Right? Again, I go back to, this was the execution punishment du jour, and there were people being crucified every day. This was not something that people didn't see. This was a common occurrence. So, and with these three people, what's three more dead Jews when it comes to Rome ruling the world? I know that sounds harsh, but that's how Rome operated. Keep the peace. That was the most important thing. And so that's who Pilate seems to be, willing to keep the peace rather than uphold justice. And as a result, Jesus goes to his death. Now, it's part of the plan of salvation, but there's always a human element to this. And I think it helps us to understand some of those human elements when we're trying to take in everything that we're talking about here in the Bible. So, for us, what's the lesson? Right? I always want to, what's the lesson? What do we get out of today's reading? Right? What do we do? Are we just about keeping the peace? Or are we about being truthful? Right? Are we about being led by God in these moments? Or are we relying on our own intuition and our own experiences? It's an interesting question. And at times when the pressure is on, sometimes we just react. And this is why in these moments of calm, we have to rely on God and learn to and practice to rely on him. Because that way then in these moments of intense pressure, our immediate reaction will be one of practice and one that's automatic. All right, I got to go to God with this. But Pilate doesn't do that. Pilate just is relying on politics. And, and even today, we see where that gets us. Have a great rest of your day. Lord willing, we'll talk again tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.